today to talk about the broad media landscape and hate. We have three esteemed researchers here, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves, and Dr. Cruz is joining us on Zoom.
Hi, I'm Saadia. I'm an assistant professor in computer science. Oh, there we go. And I'm also with the Bunch Center for African American Studies. My relationship with Ish is that Hello. Okay, I think this is good. So I've been working on the involvement of AI in content moderation and hate speech for some time, particularly looking into what are equity issues with the deployment of AI-based content moderation tools and issues with their robustness that affect users in deployments. So I got involved with Ish because we were working on a project around how do we actually bring in perspectives from communities who are targeted by hate speech and toxic content into the actual development process. And we have a project where we've been working on a participatory framework for annotation of the training data used for these tools and creating content moderation tools that are able to capture varying values and norms across these communities and ensure that we have equitable decisions in terms of content moderation across those communities.
Okay, so I'm Tim Groeling. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication. I was laughing earlier when David was saying it's hard to track the number of different projects they funded, and I'm part of that problem, I think, because I have a finger in a bunch of different pots here, in part because my department for the last 50 years has built this massive television news archive that is being used on a bunch of different projects to study mass media presentations of hate over time. So when Howard was talking about the homelessness project, he was able to use our recordings to track how television news presented that over time. And so that, and then Russian disinformation project was also using our data. I had a team of undergraduates working tirelessly for the last few years studying how LA local news presents. It wasn't hate directly, but we were interested in maybe precursors of that, which is how information about crime and race were presented to the public, especially victim narratives and how that information is conveyed. And I guess I'll get into the details of that a little bit more later on, but undergraduates were basically really grooving 1989 LA local news and comparing it to what they saw in 2019 across a random sample, and also getting to know the newscasters and Chris Pear and all that fun stuff from the 80s. So it was really illuminating for them. And then also separately, one of my main areas of research is credibility of information, how persuasion works, how people might be persuaded to change deeply held views. So part of that is dealing with misinformation and whether or not you can change people's minds if they believe things that aren't true, and what things might make that more successful or less successful. So that line of experimental research I've largely been doing with my PhD student, Jae-Hoon Che, who's actually the PI on our most recent round of these grants. And so basically, that's more of controlled experiments, and then the original set is more observational, so I'm trying to mix those two into a broader project. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for letting me be a part of this. As I always like to say, I'm the director of Ish Michigan's branch, and I've been working with Ish for a couple of years now. And mostly we work on misinformation and hate, and looking at developing and testing new interventions to address misinformation and to promote good uses of information in politics, mostly in countries like the Philippines, but extending to different regions around the world as well.
Great. So this panel is about hate in the broad media landscape, and so we are going to be talking first. I can also stop. You want me to shout?
No, I will figure out the thing in a second.
Okay. So we're going to start by talking about what is hate, what does it look like in the broad media landscape, which includes print media, television news, social media, and then we're going to talk about how it impacts people, and then we're going to talk about interventions. So what can we actually do to mitigate the hate that we're seeing in media today? So I wanted to start off with a question about different patterns, changing patterns that we're seeing over time of hate in the media, and I thought that Tim could speak to his work first, your research project, because you are specifically looking at patterns in media and how hate has changed over time.
So, yeah, and thank you. So we're doing a little less directly again, not hate specifically, but looking at differential patterns of coverage of race and violence that I think are related to that. One, and again, those who attended the presentation last year, I gave a capsule version of this then, but just to summarize, my students were kind of surprised how racist 1989 news was, and how much of an improvement there had been in 2019. So I mean, if people are looking for positive changes over time, that's definitely an area where there's less overt and less, I would say, code wording of racism. So the fixation on gangs, in particular, in 1989 is extremely racially coded, and my students are very sensitive to that. The way in which victimization was covered in 1989, white victims were given disproportionate coverage for equivalent crimes. Comparing the statistics of the actual incidence of the crime versus what was shown in the news media. It was relatively unusual. Like, it was basically priced in that crime in certain neighborhoods, and they would say this explicitly, sometimes was not surprising, and thus would get less coverage. And it was very different in 2019, comparatively speaking. One of the things that was very interesting in terms of maybe a potential agent of change, which is jumping to the third question a little bit, was the coverage we saw in 2019 was much more even-handed on the basis of the race of the victim than it was in 1989. But part of that also, when we dug deeply, and again, my students read these stories in some detail, was in part because community action, was in part because of community reaction that was being covered that seemed to stimulate more news coverage. So we looked at that in terms of whether or not the stories also mentioned that somebody was angry or sad about that death. And that seemed to correlate very highly with the jump in the coverage of non-white victims that were covered with explicit mentions of their race. We found less strong or significant results on the sort of perpetrator side. Other people have studied that and sort of found patterns that seem to ebb and flow. But at least on the victim side, it is something where there is, at least as of 2019, much more even-handed, much more balanced, much more connected to the underlying data, although still a bias towards white victims getting disproportionate coverage compared to the actual number of violent crimes with white victims. So that's a quick summary. Sure.
And we'll return to the theme of kind of community action when we talk about interventions. But Saadia, first, AI is kind of a blip in the arc of human history. It's so new. But I'd love to hear a little bit about how you see AI as changing these patterns of hate that are displayed online.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as you just said, when looking back into the past, when we're thinking about the way that media might perpetuate or instigate hate, it was all looking at human language. Now we're in this era where we have these very powerful computational models, these large language models like ChatGPT, that are able to generate content that isn't necessarily discernible from human language at a scale that humans aren't capable of. And there's a lot of potential risks that come along with that, as well as some negative outcomes that we're already observing and trying to come up with interventions against, where we can see cases of people trying to misuse these large language models specifically for either creating hateful examples or creating content that might then create an environment that's more conducive to hateful and violent behaviors that going way back, only 4 years ago, there was a well-cited paper from, I think it was the Middlebury Counterterrorism Center, that was talking about the kind of risk that might emerge with these large language models in terms of perpetuating far-right extremism. More recently, there was a report showing that internet manipulators were already using platforms like OpenAI's platform for influence operations. So this is a very real problem that we're now dealing with, where we have these cases of these large language models being used to further specific agendas. And that connects a lot of the work going on in my research group, where we're focusing on hate, but we're also focusing on misinformation and the relationship between the two, and looking at the capabilities of large language models for persuasion, and how do we think about evaluations that can take into account not just the positive aspects of persuasion with large language models and the ways in which we can use them themselves as interventions to try to counter this vast influx of harmful language being spread in digital spaces, but also how can we evaluate their capabilities for negative persuasion and actually perpetuating harmful behaviors, and develop new safety methods that might make them harder to misuse in that way. So that's one aspect of how AI is reshaping the landscape in terms of hate speech. Another aspect that I want to get into that relates to our ISH project is actually the intervention side. So we've seen a lot over the past few years. There's been a lot of interest in adaptation of these technologies, generative AI technologies like ChatGPT, to try to actually scale up content moderation efforts, with the motivation that large language models don't get tired, large language models are not going to have mental health effects from going into these digital spaces and interacting with hate speech. And so it seems like these could be useful tools in combating the harmful behaviors that we're seeing online. But then in my prior research and research from others, what we've been seeing is that they're not infallible. There's a lot of works that still needs to be done here. And some of the errors actually made by these models when they're used as intervention tools could actually perpetuate harms that they're being deployed to stop. So there was some work that we did a few years ago that was picked up by a lot of news media, including Fortune, among others, and Forbes, that was showing that there were higher cases of them falsely flagging African-American English speakers as using hate speech, which could lead to this ironic situation where the very tools that are being deployed as interventions to protect these communities are actually then leading to this cultural erasure and harming those users. And so that's motivated a lot of the work that I'm now doing on trying, how do we actually develop technologies where we're bringing in people who are going to be affected by their decisions into the process of developing these technologies to try to preemptively prevent some of these errors that might arise and inequities that might arise from the deployment of these tools.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. It's a strange world where we have AI-generated content being checked by humans and human-generated content checked by AI, and kind of switching roles a lot. Can you just briefly define content moderation in case people don't know, because we'll be coming back to it.
Right. So when I'm talking about content moderation, I'm broadly talking about tools, strategies, rule systems that are used in determining what content should be visible on these digital platforms like Twitter and Facebook, and what content should actually be either removed from that platform or flagged in some way. So there's various different approaches to this. There's full censorship kind of approach where you would think about removing any kind of content that's been determined as harmful. And then there's less strict approaches like what the former Twitter, now X, is using, community notes, where they have users flag certain content as potentially being harmful and provide some explanation for why it might be harmful. So there's different approaches to this, but broadly it's talking about governance of these online spaces and how do we determine whether content is harmful or safe.
Thank you. I don't know if Cesi can hear us, but could she share a little bit? Okay, great. Hi. Could you share a little bit about how hate is showing up in your research in the Philippines in the during election times?
Hi everyone. Yes, thank you. I can. It was nice to be able to hear everybody else. I think for me, the trends that we're seeing with hate, I think, are coinciding with two political trends and changes in politics that are happening at the same time that are making it almost more difficult to deal with, right? Or sort of exacerbating the effects of hate when we're thinking about political landscapes and especially around election time. And one of those things, I think, in terms of these sort of dangerous trends is the rise of a more populist type of politics, right? So in one hand, there's sort of nothing inherently wrong with the idea of populism if you think about it in terms of bringing politics to the people. But in practice, what ends up is because these kind of movements arise from this sort of fundamental disenchantment with politics in the sense that people's voices haven't been heard, a lot of the way that politicians use to consolidate their power and support in these types of settings is to sort of create this very contentious or very polarized brand of politics. And that's where I think a lot of the new ways that we're seeing hate play out in political messaging has come in. Because a big part of the populist playbook is sort of casting us versus them type of rhetoric. And so that's usually what we're seeing in terms of sort of hate speech or discourse, hateful discourse in like political settings in a way that we hadn't really seen that before. I think this is sort of a new type of political communication in that sense. The other trend that I think stands out in my mind when we're thinking about hate and the sort of broader issues around it is the fact that the nature of political communications are changing, right? The people are now getting their political information, not just from the news or from their neighbors, but from social media, TikTok, a whole variety of different things that happen to also play well with the type of populist playbooks and emotional campaign messaging in a way that, before you could imagine that we would have debates and policies and that sort of thing. But nowadays with TikTok, it's really difficult, right? In a 20-second TikTok to articulate your economic position. And by contrast, much easier if you're running a campaign that's based on sort of setting up an us versus them type of dynamic, to have a message that's really leaning on this sort of hate or this sort of very relational type of polarization that's happening in the country by scaring people about immigrants, for example. That's sort of a very common populist politician strategy to sort of create that connection with the voters by casting an outgroup of some sort as the enemy. And so to me, those are the two big trends, I think, that are making hate even more difficult to address when it comes to political communication and political information. And the fact that because of social media being a big source of political information and political discourse, it's also this sort of a doubly bad effect in the sense that just participating, engaging in these communities can sort of reinforce social identities, right? So it sort of makes people even more entrenched, right? So they're not just getting hateful messaging through these sources, but by replying, connecting, right, sharing the information, they're sort of reinforcing it as part of a social identity that makes it much harder for us to address with just purely, corrective type of information, right? So we're also seeing a lot of the trends and interventions is that we're seeing interventions having a backlash effect, right? Because once you get to that point where part of my social identity is being somebody that is really, that's against immigrants, or being somebody that is very particular about who I think an American is, or who I think a citizen of the country is, then even when we try to do these corrective interventions that might have worked, even just a couple of years ago, because it's no longer just about information, but it's about this broader idea of community and social identity, we're finding in a lot of cases that these purely correction or fact-checking type of interventions simply haven't been working.
That's fascinating and disheartening. Ceci, I'd like to stay with you for a minute to talk a little bit more about how people are countering hate that they're seeing online. In your research, can you give us some examples of how people are countering hate during elections in particular?
That's great, and thank you for your patience with making this work so I can participate. I think there's sort of two kind of answers to that, right? One in the sense of what we're finding in places like the Philippines and even the U.S., where because of partly AI and what Saadia was talking about, is that the evolution of different ways to produce hateful content. The coding, hiding hateful content under things that look, pretty innocuous to bypass filters. So there's sort of that has far outpaced our ability to come up with technological solutions for finding and identifying the hate. So what you mentioned about how, having ordinary people, being the sort of frontline defense has been exactly the type of interventions that we've been focusing on in the Philippines, right? Precisely because there's not that kind of infrastructure to be able to create filters, do content moderation, all those types of things that you could imagine sometimes we have in places like the US. And so what the focus of our intervention has been thinking about countering hate as beyond a story about misinformation, right? So what we're trying to address is like a twofold type of thing. One is making communities as a whole more resilient, right? And the communities are an important piece of this, because if we think about this vulnerability to misinformation and hate as not just something about whether I know the information or not, but whether I feel like as part of this community I'm supposed to believe this, then it becomes really important to target our interventions to communities, right? To people's network, right? And that also lets us leverage social norms in a nicer way, right? To kind of get people thinking about, in this community, we help each other find the right answers, or in this community, it's important for us to tell the truth. And so that becomes the focus of that sort of, on one hand, resilience building interventions that we've been doing in the Philippines. And that has had a great effect on getting people to sort of confront, I guess, or dialogue with other people in their community. So, as they see something being shared that's hateful, they can then say, oh, you know what, I've seen, and in a way that's much more natural, right, than if it were some content like external NGO or content moderation. So these are just sort of neighbors supporting each other and helping each other find the right information. So we've seen a lot of positive effects with that. We've also seen, as another effect of our community-based trainings, was essentially changing people's information diets, right? So instead, they still use TikTok, don't get me wrong, people are still using TikTok, but if you ask them where they get their political information or where they get their news, the share that comes from TikTok becomes smaller. Right, so they're still using Facebook and TikTok just as much as before, dog pictures, watching funny videos, etc. Just that they're relying on those sources less for politics, right? And so to us, that was the easiest behavioral change to make. It's very difficult to teach people how to identify misinformation because, like Saadia was saying, the AI is so good now that even for me, my aunties will send me something and I'll have to look it up. right? It'll be like Trump said, Trump is giving money to Duterte for his defense at the ICC. I'm like, especially nowadays, like you hear something crazy on the news, it might be true, right? We have politicians in the US that are so unpredictable that it's hard to be able to guess whether something is true or not. So my thinking is, if I'm somebody that studies this topic and I still have to look up, these things to know if it's misinformation or not, how are we going to train people to do this? And so the focus of our interventions has been on the sort of broader community resilience, right? And together with that, an ability to use sources and source cues to help people identify like what's a good source and what isn't. Even if it's very, very difficult to get them to the point where they can learn to distinguish what's misinformation and not. And in fact, actually, I think one weird effect of getting people to stop using TikTok and Facebook for their political news is that if they're presented with an entirely new set of misinformation, they won't have the exposure, right? So they won't even know about it in advance, and so it's harder for them to be able to tell the difference. However, if you pair that with a source cue, like you say, this misinformation or this piece of information came from, the New York Times, right? Or you came from BBC. Then what we find is that the people who receive these trainings do a much better job than people who didn't, right? So it's sort of a good and bad, right? Like we're not quite to the point where the interventions can get people to identify it well enough, but we can sort of foster more community level resilience, and we can foster these sort of healthy information diets, if that makes sense, and teach people how to use those other clues that they have that are about the information to sort of help them make those choices and evaluate the information in much more sophisticated ways.
Thank you, Cesi. And that's so true. If we, as researchers, cannot understand whether what we're seeing is truthful or false, that's a bigger problem that needs to be managed. So, to that end, I wanted to talk more about interventions. And I was just talking to someone about how it feels like in this time, the question on all of our lips is, what can we do? A lot of us feel so powerless with everything happening right now. So, Tim, maybe you could give us some insights into the trends that you're seeing and how we as audience members can better understand what we're seeing in the media now, in the local news. What are kind of the hallmarks of hateful speech or language, or like what are you seeing in your research that helps us understand what we're seeing as hate, even if it's not coded that way?
Thanks. And I'm actually going to jump off a little bit what Cesi was saying as well, because she, I think, was doing a very good job talking about one of the problems that Jay Hoon and I are trying to deal with as well, which is the fact-checking, the sort of misinformation correction that people had a lot of high hopes for has obviously not stemmed the tidal wave of misinformation in the real world. So part of what we've been trying to do rigorously is understand, what is this disconnect between the laboratory, where people are still finding great results that are kind of surprising, like you'll find people exposed to counter-attitudinal political information that, it's anti-Republican fact check, and they're like, okay, I'm a Republican, I believe that in the lab, but we don't see that as much in the real world. So part of what we've been trying to do is understand, where this falls down. So one thing that Jay Hoon has just finished doing a relatively large-scale examination of X/Twitter data of how are they exposed to fact checks? Like when you see them referenced online, who is sending them? Most people are not going to those sites. They have very little traffic. So it's mostly people sharing them. And what you find is motivated reasoning. You find Democrats sharing fact checks of Republicans that say Republicans are false, not actually sharing information where Democrats are rated false. You see Republicans undermining the credibility, citing the fact checks to dispute them and to basically say they're wrong, or in other cases to make fun of them or share parody ones that are making fun of the entire enterprise of fact checking. So when you're exposed to these things on social media by somebody who has sent it to you, they have had a motivation that is not your more correct information. They're doing it for politically motivated reasons. So that's one flaw with the current system of how people are exposed to fact checks, is they're not often exposed to them by somebody who's trying to enlighten them versus to motivate them politically. When we look also at fact check exposure in the traditional lab model and you expose people to a fact check, we were able to demonstrate that if you just show them the fact check, they're pretty persuaded. If you show someone either attacking the credibility of the fact check organization or disputing the fact check, the effects go away. So that is also very common for people to be sharing a fact check to dispute it, and in effect inoculating people against that information in the future and nulling out the result. So that was, I think, a relatively strong result. The other thing that we did in again, Jehoon set up methodologically a very rigorous and clever experiment that tested not just the effect of how long these fact checks last in people's minds, the answer is 4 days, before the effects go away. So you're fighting the ocean that is washing away your sandcastle. It will not last more than 4 days probably if you fact check somebody, unless it's sustained. So comparing that versus one where you don't necessarily make people go through the entire process, but just ask them an accuracy reminder of, is this information accurate? Not even telling them it's wrong, but just asking them. That actually sustains the effect for a long time. So just making people prioritize thinking of accuracy when they're evaluating political information, just keeping that top of mind actually can sustain the effect for a long time. And then we're also experimenting, but haven't deployed in the field yet. Still hopeful ideas that misinformation correction, even on highly polarized issues, can bring people, if you sustain it in these sort of ways, lasting change in their attitudes. So that was a quick, and mostly about the new stuff. I can also talk about the local news changes briefly. So again, I think it really does make a difference to not have the news organizations be encoders and perpetuators of this stuff, which is really, as I mentioned, gone away. When we did our initial set of results, I was surprised because we didn't see a big effect. When my students were coding stories that had what they thought was racial or other types of discrimination in the story, but then we subdivided by whether or not it was coverage of a crime or coverage that basically the news organization was injecting this bias themselves. And the big difference between our 2 years is there's much more coverage of these sort of hate crimes now than there was in 1989. And there's much less of the news organization basically saying casually racist things or otherwise injecting it themselves. So I think there's a heightened, in the more recent year, a heightened awareness of these things happening in the community and less perpetuation of it by the news organizations.
Saadia, could you share a little bit about the interventions that you're most excited about, that you're working on? Perhaps you could talk about your community-engaged intervention research.
Yeah, so I can start by talking about that project. A lot of the work that we've been doing around interventions is more reactionary, thinking about when content is already being spread on these platforms. How do we come up with tools to deal with this? So for that particular direction, then my PhD student Ashima has been working on the participatory framework that I mentioned, where we've been looking at 8 different communities of people who have been historically targeted by hate speech, and how do existing tools function when we re-annotate hate speech benchmarks to reflect perspectives from those communities, and finding that a lot of the existing tools are actually not aligned with the perspectives of people in the targeted communities, with varying results. So my students been doing pretty comprehensive analysis across these different groups, looking at what are the differences when you consider the perspectives of people within the communities versus the perspectives of annotators outside of those communities, and seeing that there are a number of cases for which people outside the communities may see harm where there is no harm. That's the case of where we could see this kind of cultural erasure problem that I mentioned earlier, where there could be examples of reclaimed language that's used within communities, and that's considered legitimate and not harmful within that community, but is viewed differently outside of that community. And then also cases where people outside of that community were missing harmful examples because they didn't have the lived experiences to actually identify that this is maybe a subtler, more coded example of hate speech or toxic language. And so we've also been developing new tools based on this data that we collected that are able to make decisions that are more in line with perspectives from those communities, as well as public policies from platforms of how they deal with content moderation. So we were showing that these tools are more in line with Facebook's content moderation policies, for example, and that work is coming out publicly later this week. It's called Model Citizens. In terms of how do we actually shift behavior before it reaches to this critical point of actually turning into toxic language or hate speech, this more proactive kind of approach we could take to interventions. That's work that we've been doing as well on the misinformation side. So there's some work that my student Solomon has been leading that it'll also be out soon, where we're looking at how AI can actually help in raising the online literacy of social media users and alerting them to potentially incredible content and shifting their beliefs in cases where we have this confirmation bias phenomena that Tim was talking about, where people are more likely to share content or believe content that reinforces the cognitive biases that they have, or if they have a certain political bias that reinforces that. And so in that work, we're looking at when you have two different language models that are arguing for opposing sides of opinion on the claim, and you have users analyze this interaction, this debate that's going on between these language models, that actually helps them in better discerning the reliability of the claim, where we're seeing major improvement in the user's ability to discern reliability when they have mainstream beliefs, but we're also seeing a small effect where it's helping them, assisting them in identifying reliability of claims, even if they have strong prior beliefs.
Thank you. So just to wrap up, I think we've talked about interventions at a few different levels. We've talked about individual level interventions where you're kind of educating individuals, or content moderation, flagging things on Twitter about things that are false according to the New York Times or what have you. We have kind of community norm setting, community resilience interventions. There seem to be more structural level interventions. To my knowledge, no one from Meta is here in the audience, but I do know that we have some people involved in government. So I thought we could finish up the panel with some recommendations that you think that policymakers and governments could take into account. What do you think that governments can do, local, state level, federal, well, maybe not federal at this point, but whatever level government you want to speak to, what you think they can do specifically about hate in the broad media landscape that you're studying. And I'll start with Cesi.
I think for me, if I had a wish list for government and policymakers, is to think about misinformation not really as it sounds silly because as the word information is in the name of the problem, but to think of it not as an information deficit, but as a social problem, a social phenomenon, right? And that we need to think about interventions that can leverage the types of community environments and sort of information networks that people are a part of. And especially when we're looking outside the US, when we're thinking about how to produce interventions that are not just scalable, but also culturally embedded, right? That are more appropriate to the different contexts that it exists in. Those are really key issues for avoiding backlash. And avoiding the possibility that we're essentially, you can imagine making people more well-informed, but then maybe you're pulling apart, you're increasing polarization, or you have these other types of difficult effects. So to me, the biggest ask is to think about misinformation not as a sort of very individual type of problem, but as a problem with the information environment as a whole, the political information environment as a whole. I also think from a policy perspective, it's much easier to teach people how to identify good sources or to support good sources and access to good sources rather than trying to do a lot of content moderation or trying to pass laws that are, just because with technology it's so hard to get ahead of it, right? And it almost seems a bit like there's if government can do something or policymakers can do something, it'll be in creating an infrastructure that makes it easier for people to find their own information, right? Or to find their own good sources of information rather than trying to stop all of the bad information from getting out, right? So they can still do that too. I'm not saying we give up and we just let everybody post their hate speech online, but trying to get that down to 100% is, I think, a really difficult battle to have. And it's better to instead think about how do we make our communities more resilient to this type of speech and these types of effects. The last is, I think, thinking about how to foster this broader, healthier political information environment, right? So producing, like in the Philippines, for example, one thing that we find works really well is just making politicians commit to what their policy positions are and then giving that information to voters. So those are things where the government can do that. The Elections Commission was thinking about scaling that up. There's all these sort of efforts and ways to think about how they can be a source of good information and how they can support that broader infrastructure and environment. Especially we're seeing a lot of, like threats against the media in places like the US, right? So we can't, it looks like maybe it doesn't have a whole lot to do with misinformation and hate, but it really does, right? Because the minute we're cutting back on the healthy parts of our information environment, it makes being able to police the hate speech and other like really harmful content much more difficult. Because I think it needs to be a two-pronged approach, right? You have to also foster that resilience for individuals and communities, in addition to the types of policies that or rules that you want to put on what kind of information can be produced and shared. So for me, it's like, can we think about this a little bit broader? That'd be like number one thing on my policy wish list for sure.
I think that was extremely well said. If there's anything that I would add on to that, I would bring up a recent case that happened where there was an interaction between AI chatbot and a child that the outcome of this was the child ended up committing suicide, and there's now an ongoing legal case between the developers of that chatbot and the family, where the developers tried to use the argument that chatbots have free speech, which was recently thrown out in that legal case. But I think this really is one example that highlights how dangerous these emerging technologies that we don't understand very well could potentially be and have already possibly been, and that we do need a more concrete regulatory framework around these technologies, the same as we do for a lot of other products, same as we do for cars, for transportation, for example, where if people's lives are at stake, then we need to have some safety measures in place to ensure to mitigate the risks of misuse that we're now seeing. So I am not sure how conducive the current political environment is to this, but I know prior to recent times there were some efforts being put in place to try to come up with a blueprint for AI safety that was still very open-ended. It's kind of nebulous, and so in the future I would really like to see more concrete policy around that. Maybe following up from what we've seen in other areas, like with the FDA and with healthcare. There's more regulation around AI in healthcare.
So I'd like to agree 100% that our current political communication environment and our current state of AI are both terrifying. Like, I don't say that word lightly. We're in a terrifying environment where the ability to counteract false information from our existing institutions has been weakened because those institutions are much weaker. The trust in news media, the trust in the sort of public professional group that we entrusted for decades to help us solve this problem has dropped to catastrophically low levels. So if you're looking at an AI-generated clip that somebody's spreading on TikTok versus what the evening news is saying, you know, that's a fair fight, and it shouldn't be right now. People are going to treat the AI-generated content potentially with the same amount of base credibility in that. So I think that we need to think very seriously about how we're going to protect and establish greater public faith in a canonical version of the truth. So we're an institution that should be doing this. Like, universities are the stockpile of knowledge for society. That's why we're here. That's why they pay us to be here, is to do this task for the society. And we're doing a lot of those things, like our libraries. If you want to know if something is true or not, making it so we are vouching for this. It is in our library. This is the actual version of it, that people can say, this is a chain of custody, so I can trust this, versus random things that are distributed peer-to-peer as almost gossip online. I think that we need to take that role more seriously and foster ways for people to have an easy entree into a higher version of information than they get on social media. So that's one dimension. On the news side, you can't make people watch the news. But you can potentially, if you're a news organization, work on ways to increase public trust through transparency, through being much more open in your processes, through making things much more accessible to the public that allow them to see not just the final product, but the sort of stages along that process. So I think that there are a lot of things that we could do to foster, it doesn't have to be every news organization, but I think there need to be some news organizations that put an even higher premium now on professionalism, on transparency, and on establishing basically a paper trail or some sort of chain of custody of the information they put out there, so that people know they can go to that organization and get the information they need to trust it. And when they weigh in, it is not going to be partisan. It is not going to be biased. And I think that's pre-positioning a resource that we're all going to need, because the sort of ability to generate AI video, like you've seen with Google tool, it's terrifyingly good. It is terrifyingly good, and it is just going to get better. And I say better, I mean worse, in terms of being able to distinguish it from reality. So we need to think about how to pre-position information that people can trust and make it accessible to fight against it now, because that battle can be lost in months compared to where we are now. It is terrifying.
Thank you, everyone, for bearing with us during the technical difficulties. It sounds like we'll take a short break and resume in a few minutes. Thanks.